reference it later on.
Oh,
Can everyone see? Let me go ahead and put it in full screen mode. Can everyone see the PowerPoint up there?
yep.
You can just put in the chat.
Yes.
Okay, okay. Just want to make sure folks can see. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to talk a bit more about how you can center justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity in your research. This has always been a timely topic, but I think it's even more timely because of just everything that's going on in higher ed, everything that's going on in terms of where we're at as a culture, society, politics in the United States. I would argue that centering DEIJ in your research is even more imperative than before. And so, what I'd like to go ahead and do is show you all a quick agenda that I have. Again, if you did attend my session over the summer where I talked about centering DEIJ in your research, the first part of today's workshop is going to sound very similar to that. I do want to broadly define what is DEIJ research because I think it's important that we're all working based upon the same definition. And then I'll talk about what does DEIJ research for today's workshop. What does that look like if you're coming from like a quantitative perspective? I know we have some quant researchers in the room. And then also, what does that look like when you're coming from a qualitative perspective? Do I have any mixed method people in the room? I can't remember off the top of my head. Drop in the chat if you're like even remotely interested in mixed methods. While I don't talk about that a great deal in today's workshop, I do think that also those who are coming from a mixed methods perspective benefit greatly from this type of lens when you're conducting research. Hey, okay, yes, we do have two people, Tranisha and then Diana, are mixed method researchers. So I'm excited about that. All right, before I begin kind of talking about, what is DEIJ research, what I'd like to first do is have you all just take a few seconds or a few minutes, however long it takes you, to consider why are you doing the research that you're doing? What is the purpose of it? What really drives you? And I think for some of us, again, given the broader, social political environment that we find ourselves in, we have to dig even deeper to find our why, right? And so if you can just put in the chat just a few words or few sentences, I should say, explaining what is your purpose, what drives you in your research agenda, what are you trying to accomplish? So yeah, I'll give you all some time to jot that down in the chat. Or if you feel more comfortable, you can just simply unmute yourself. Either way is fine. Well, yeah, I love that. Um, for individuals with marginalized social identities to feel a sense of belonging in education. And it's just as simple as that, right? Sometimes I feel like when people ask me about what is my why in research, I feel a lot of pressure to come up with this like very profound, like groundbreaking reason. And for me, it's to make sure that the experiences very similar to Oya, marginalized people are seen and heard, are valued, and that marginalized people are indeed humanized, especially when we have a history of dehumanization and oppression, is particularly in the United States, but I know in a lot of Western countries, like England and Canada as well, have some similar histories for sure. Veronica, they put making systems better for the user. I love that. Absolutely. Kristen put advancing the goals of open education or the open education movement so more students can benefit. Also extremely important. And in terms of benefiting, like also thinking more intentionally about like what do we mean by benefit, right? I see a lot of research coming out of our community in open education, those who are kind of interrogating like who gets to decide what is beneficial. So, Kristen, I'm actually really curious about your research and what comes of that. Virginia put in the chat increasing access to quality instruction and resources. Absolutely. Jess also put, currently I'm in the early stages of drafting a grant application with the community partner. Ooh, I love research with community partners. And we'll talk a bit about how DEIJ research is not just about producing research for the sake of, knowledge production. It's what kind of social impact can you have as well. And so, Jess, I'm excited that you have a community partner in play, but who is interested in conducting an environmental scan to get a more accurate picture of community needs, which will inform their programming, hopefully be leveraged by other not-for-profit to inform their advocacy work. Very specific, and that is totally fine. But that's what I'm up to now. That sounds amazing and incredible. And I'm also excited to see what comes of that. Heather put promoting access to high quality education for all students. Excellent. Dranisha put advancing STEM education research through the lens of open education and open pedagogy. Yes, yes. Audrisa, I might actually connect you. We might have talked about this, but I might connect you with the RIOS group, which stands for the Racially Inclusive and Open Education, Racial Justice, Inclusive, Open Education, excuse me, and STEM education. They're a great just group that connects people who are interested in the intersection between STEM education, open education, also looking at it through more of an inclusive lens. So if I haven't already done so, I'll definitely connect you with them. Very oriented, getting things done to broaden the movement's reach, that being open education, getting faculty more on board. Excellent, excellent. I really need to consciously stay aligned with DEIB goals. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, it's very easy in open education to lose sight of justice as well, even though when you think about OER and open education, it's a very radical approach to education, given our systems and the way that they're kind of built. But we don't more intentionally lead with social justice, if that makes any sense. So I appreciate that transparency, Kristen. Mandy put supporting faculty to have the agenda of freedom to teach in creative and meaningful ways. Wow, that is so, so important, especially now because I think a lot of faculty are scared to take risks, I would say more than previous years. So Mandy, I think your work is extremely important for sure. And no worries, Kristen, DEIJ, DEIB. I know there's all these different acronyms to basically kind of capture the same thing. So thank you all so much who were able to put their why in the chat. I just saw something really quickly from Stacy. I'm not sure my research has had an organizing principle, but mostly inquiring to understand why things are the way they are or things that irk or anger me. Yes, yes. I love using anger and even like this might sound politically incorrect, but like rage as a motivating reason why like you're so invested in the research question, right? I think, anger can be a very useful emotion, a useful tool as we're thinking about our why and our research. So again, thank you so much for that, Stacy. Yeah, Veronica put, I love a spite-based research agenda. Yes. Great, Virginia. Yes, yes. All right. Well, I don't think I see anything else in the chat. If it's okay with you all, I'm gonna go ahead and move on here. Um, as I'm talking about DEIJ or DEIJ lens in research, I think it's really, really important to keep in mind that, you know, all of the research that we're trying to do, there is some type of bias, whether that's how we choose to design our research, whether it's how we frame our questions or phrase our questions, whether it's if you're coming from more of a quantitative perspective, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, the type of variables that you use when you're, for example, doing a multiple regression, right? There's all kinds of bias and assumption built into these processes. And I got this idea from a very, very, very famous education scholar by the name of Gloria Ladson Billings. Some of you might have read her work, especially if you're coming more from like a critical education perspective, if you're studying anything related to the intersections between race and education. Dr. Ladson Billings is just that woman. And she's very, very adamant about challenging us to come to terms with the fact that all research quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, there is some type of bias in it. And as soon as we can accept that, we can really do the good, meaningful work behind our research. All right, so DEIJ research can be defined a lot of different ways, y'all. When I was preparing for this presentation over the summer, I actually, to be transparent with you all, I was a little overwhelmed trying to figure out, okay, how can we define DEIJ research? Because oftentimes when we talk about just DEIJ in general, we're lumping these terms, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice. I think someone in the chat earlier mentioned the B that stands for belonging usually. And while they're ultimately trying to accomplish the same broader goal, they serve a very, very different purpose. And because of that, I was like, should we not lump these things together? But I think I landed on something that is doable in terms of a definition. So when you're using a DEIJ lens in your research, what you're truly examining are broader systems of power and privilege, right? And your goal here has some type of, in terms of your research goal, has some type of equity and justice mission to it, okay? And we're also making sure that we're considering various different lived experiences in our data. We're asking questions like, who's left out, whose experiences is not in our data set, if you will. I think another key part of DEIJ research is keeping in mind that when we are doing this type of research, we really are doing something radical. And the reason why I say that is because if you're centering this type of lens in your research process, you are okay with doing research different from your colleagues, right? You're okay with, challenging traditional assumptions about what it means to be a researcher or even the actual process, the type of questions that you're asking. Again, you'll hear me talk a lot in today's workshop about letting go of this notion of neutrality and being objective, because historically, researchers and other people in positions of power have used this guise of, objectivity and being neutral as a way to essentially harm people who come from marginalized groups. And so if you are remotely interested in centering a DEIJ lens in your research and you find yourself, I don't want to say at odds with your colleagues, but just doing things differently from your colleagues, you're probably doing this research correctly. So here's just, again, some working definitions of DEIJ research. You yourself, as you're looking at these two, like kind of components of DEIJ research, you might think to yourself, oh, I wonder if, such and such is, or this study I was reading recently, an example of DEIJ research. We'll actually do an activity about that later on today. All right, so there are a lot of different types of DEIJ research approaches, if you will. This list that you see here, it is not a comprehensive, exhaustive list by any means. Some of you might have heard of these type of research approaches. So feminist research is typically considered a type of DEIJ research. If you're coming from more of an activist, justice-oriented approach to research, so again, thinking about how research can help you accomplish a more justice-oriented mission. That's also, of course, DEIJ research, anti-racism research. You will hear me talk later on today about crit quant or quant crit. You'll see me use those terms like interchangeably, but it's basically the same thing. And then I'll also talk about later on today, from a qualitative perspective, participatory action research, which is PAR, that's the acronym, when we involve the people that we are researching into the research design process. But like I said, this list by no means is an exhaustive list. There's just a lot of things that we can touch on when it comes to this particular topic. And then if you're wondering, okay, what's the criteria when it comes to using a DEIJ lens in your research? There are a couple of things to consider. Number one, you want to make sure that you are including stories, experiences that historically have been considered abnormal or historically marginalized or underrepresented, right? So all these terms that we kind of keep like using interchangeably, if you will, We want to make sure that we're centering those voices, that we're actually starting from that standpoint instead of like comparing those experiences with those experiences that have been historically centered, if you will. And then also, it's not enough just to include people who, for example, are people of color, who are women, who are LGBTQ plus individuals in your data set. It really is examining the larger structures, the larger systems that they have to navigate through that then affects their lived experience, right? So it's not enough to include me as a Black queer woman in your data set, looking at these broader systems of, for example, white supremacy, and how does that affect how I show up in the world? How does that affect in terms of you as the researcher, if you have various different identities of privilege, how does that affect how you show up in the research process and the assumptions that you make about people in your data set, right? And so all of that also has to do with DEIJ research for sure. And I've touched on this before, and I'm going to continue to touch on it, making sure that the type of research that we're doing, that it is in fact ethical, that our participants can actually access our research. That's why I'm so grateful to this fellowship program, because so much of the research that we do in the academy doesn't actually reach the communities, right, that we're researching. And so, what does it look like to engage in open research, or open publishing, if you will? I know I'm kind of, preaching to the choir here, but that's a big part of DEIJ research, at least from what I have seen and experienced, making sure that the collaboration is at the core and making sure that the decisions that we make about our research process, that we're transparent about those decisions, right? To ourselves and then to the readers, to the receivers of our research. I'm going to pause here to see if I see anything in the chat. I don't, but I always just like to do little pauses here just to make sure folks are good. Yes. Yes, Virginia just put in the chat that this last part here, I'm assuming, is definitely relevant to open science and open scholarship. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, Virginia? You don't have to, but I'm just curious, like what came up for
You
you. You
put
don't
in
have
a plug for open research?
to. Right.
Twist my arm. It's like my favorite thing. But basically, I was very much trained that science is done behind closed doors. You don't show
Yeah.
materials. You obviously have to write clear methods, but the details are very proprietary and
Yeah.
very, uh, you don't want to share things, basically.
Yeah, kind of secretive. You keeping it close to your
Very
chest.
secretive.
Yeah.
Yes. And there's this worry that other people are going to use your materials and find things counter to what you found,
Hmm.
or that, you can't possibly have your data be open. So there's this movement showing that this has been a really harmful practice in science for a lot
Mm.
of reasons. I mean, one of which is obviously it's hard for new scholars because if they're not given access to these closed door meetings or somebody, then they have to develop things from scratch. And it's just a very time consuming process when we have a lot of established materials and measures that could be very useful for other people. So,
1,000%.
and then
Yes, yes.
your data open also applies to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, because somebody might have a question that never dawned on you because they had life
Mm.
experiences. Well, they can look at your
Hmm.
data and use data, which are valuable and expensive,
Yes,
and be able to look at those questions that you hadn't and get new insights without having to give
1,000%.
time and expense of collecting new data.
Correct, correct. I love what you said in terms of like there's I just feel like in the academy we're just so nervous of like sharing. I think it's, because we're ranked and rated and all that stuff. And I do get that. I don't want to move past that real fear of sharing. But my gosh, like there's just so much more benefits that can come from the act of collaboration, the act of being open. But I want to emphasize the agency and the autonomy to be open, right? Because we don't want to necessarily have open as a mandate,
Right.
because then we're just doing the same thing that, people who are not doing open work just from a different perspective. But I just appreciate you just naming that, like, that especially coming from like a social science perspective
Hmm.
or a science perspective, like there's just this fear of sharing and not being open with your data.
Or even open with your findings too, as far as
Yes.
just posted, you know.
For sure, for sure. Veronica, they put in the chat that they find the last item to be especially challenging too. Yes. They were in conversation with a colleague recently who discounted some of their more recent work because they received the journal where it was published as a pay to publish forum. Interesting. Related challenges, paying to publish open, especially when you don't have a grant line to support it. Yeah, I've heard that happen to other individuals as well, Veronica, so I am not surprised. And as I'm going through some of the themes in this presentation, this workshop, this work is not easy. This is not easy work by all means. It's very hard, especially when these broader systems and the culture doesn't necessarily automatically reward this type of work, right? And so I want to definitely give space and affirm that the fact that even though this work is necessary and important, it's not very easy to do in a lot of our context. So thank you so much for sharing that, Veronica. All right, moving on because I want to make sure we have time. I tend to just talk, 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 and I just want to make sure we have time for our activity towards the end. A couple other principles of DEIJ research before we get into like, how it looks like quantitatively and qualitatively. I've talked about this as well. So when we are trying to center a DEIJ lens in our research process, we want to keep in mind that we're not just taking from the communities that we are researching, that we're not just being, as you see here in quotes, extractive, or that I put here on my slides, extractive in the way in which we are engaging in this process. So, in other words, we're really trying to figure out what kind of social impact can my research have, whether that's informing policy, procedures, things of that sort, whether it's helping a nonprofit organization out. I know someone said they had, a community partner in mind. So we're just trying to think of all those ways in which we can get beyond the ivory towers, if you will, beyond just thinking about this just for tenure. And again, what kind of impact does my research have on the community, right? In a second, when I talk about how DEIJ research might look like from a qualitative perspective, I am going to talk about this research approach called participatory action research. Excuse me. I mentioned it before, but that's essentially when we involve people that we want to research into the actual design process. So that's a big thing that we do in general when it comes to DEIJ oriented research. We also want to make sure that we try our best to take more of an intersectional approach to research and not just assuming that our results can be generalized to everyone who, for example, is within our data set. So, for example, let's say that I wanted to look at, I don't know, the experience of female faculty trying to um, get tenure, receive tenure at an R1 institution or at R1 institutions. Well, even the term female faculty can be problematic, but we go into like conversations about how are we defining female, how are we defining gender in this case? Gender and sex are not interchangeable, so that's one thing to consider, right? When we're talking about women faculty, what kind of women? Are we only talking about white women? Are we talking about trans women? Are we talking about Latinx women, Black women, Caribbean women, right? Who could be all of the above? Okay. So again, it's really making sure that we're taking a quote unquote non-essential approach, not assuming that the experiences of white women faculty at our R1 institution can be applicable to, for example, Asian women faculty at our R1 institution. And I've already touched on this as well, but making sure that at the end of the day, the goal of our research really is to help elevate this equity and justice oriented mission for sure. And then the last thing I want to touch on before we get into how this looks quantitatively and qualitatively is kind of just briefly talking about what DEIJ research is not, because I see a lot of scholars saying that, they're centering a DEI lens in their research, but I'm like, oh, you're trying really hard, but I don't know if that's exactly DEIJ research. So simply just diversifying your data set and saying, like, hey, I've done DEIJ research. Not exactly. Again, we have to go back to how are you designing your research, right? Are you actually engaging in what we call in qualitative research reflexivity? So reflecting on your own experiences and how you may or may not be bringing that into the research process. How are you defining deficit? How are you defining your research problem, right? Even that, I think I talked about this in another workshop. The fact that we, as researchers, we are trained to think of things as a problem, that we're solving a problem, right? So we're already going into it problematizing the research process, if that makes any sense. But getting back to this first point here, simply including people who have marginalized identities is not the, oh, check, I'm doing DEIJ research. No, 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 no. What kind of questions are you asking? Are you actually examining systems of power, privilege, things of that sort? That gets us a little closer to centering DEIJ research. The second point here, I kind of I kind of jumped ahead a little bit. But we find, especially when people are examining the intersections between race and education, there is a lot of deficit oriented research out there. A lot of like, well, Black students, do not perform as well on standardized tests compared to white students, for example. There's a lot of that type of like deficit oriented research. And I am here to tell you that if your research is just coming from a deficit standpoint, I'm not sure if you're exactly really centering DEIJ research. The scholar that I've referenced before, Gloria Ladson-Billings, one of the things that she said in one of her, hundreds of keynotes that she's given, but one that I actually had the honor of attending, was that she had in her scholarship and her lifelong work, she said, I had the audacity to ask what was right with Black students, not what was wrong with Black students, right? And so that just simple reframing of our question and even our purpose, if you will, can help us center this perspective a little bit more. I've already talked about that third point here and the fourth point in terms of like really letting go of this notion of being neutral. The researcher isn't bringing anything into this process, so we're letting that go for sure. All right, so some of you all might have seen this funny little meme circulating on social media for quite some time, for years actually. This is nothing against my quantitative researchers. I love y'all, and we need both quantitative and qualitative perspectives in the research. But what I like to do for the next few minutes is essentially show you all what could DEIJ research look like if you're coming from a quantitative versus a qualitative perspective? And what are some things to look out for in general? All right, so for my quant folks in the room, you might have heard of this research approach called crit quant or quant crit. Again, I'm using these terms interchangeably. Some people call it critical quantitative, some people call it the other way around. So essentially, if you're using a quant crit perspective, you are essentially you're centering, excuse me, a social justice approach while still using your quantitative approach, right, to methods and methodology, to really investigate how larger social, political, even economic and historical patterns inform your analysis. So, quant crit really comes from and draws from, as I put up here in this definition from Garbe, that it really draws from critical race theory. It centers, or it, how do I say this? It centers the fact that, or it names the fact that we are operating within the US at least, and I would argue a lot of Western countries are operating within this larger framework of white supremacy, right? And so, how does that affect our data set? How does that affect our analyses, if you will? Another thing that Quant Crit does a really great job of is interrogating just our beliefs about what we feel like is quantitative research, you know. And so for my quantitative researchers in the room, really quickly, if you could just put in the chat, what are some traditional assumptions that we hold about quantitative research? Or for those who have ever done some type of quantitative research or using that approach, what are some assumptions that we hold about quantitative research? Yeah, Virginia put in the chat that quant data are objective. Yep. Jen put here, numbers don't lie. They are objective. That's a big thing with quantitative research for sure. Veronica, they put that they're normal. Yes, whatever that is supposed to mean. And there's a lot of harm, right? When we label something as normal in the context of research, because what does that mean for those who don't fit within that definition? Okay. Um, Drisha put that quant lacks bias. Yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of quantitative researchers, I don't think a lot in this room, but a lot that I've still have interacted with, there is a little bit of not notoriety, but like a pride, right? Like our methods are more valid than qualitative because we are quote unquote objective. We are not biased. We're not, going back to this, funny slide here. We're not this, we're just all over the place type of researchers. I've heard that from some quantitative researchers. Virginia also put in the chat that the first day of stats class numbers are not neutral and quantitative data are not objective. Yes, yes, yes. And then Veronica put that I have actually heard if I use statistics, that omits researcher bias. Ah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's tough. That is really, really tough. These notions of p-value, confidence, and all that stuff, like these are things that are made up by humans, y'all. Reliability, validity. I won't get into like the philosophy behind it too much, but I'm encouraging us to really, really just sit here and ask critical questions about what we've been taught in graduate school, or what we are currently, because I know we do have some graduate students, are being taught in grad school for sure. Just one more thing in the chat. Oh, yeah. See, also, my design is insert, whatever name of statistical test. Yes, I've heard that a lot of times, a lot of times. And I know we're laughing and I'm saying a lot of this in jest, but these type of perspectives, these traditional assumptions that, are surrounding quantitative research, they very much have been normalized. And as a result, serve to marginalize other perspectives when it comes to research. And so quick quant or quant crit really helps to undo some of those assumptions here. And so we've kind of already hit on some of the traditional assumptions of quantitative research. In terms of crit quant, I don't know why I struggle with that term, y'all, so forgive me. Here are some of the tenets. I didn't cover all of them. There are about 5 or 6, and I will include some resources for you all here in just a second. But with crit quant, basically one of the assumptions that they hold is that, this centrality of racism or the centrality of white supremacy, and understanding that the data that we are analyzing, that they are, operating within these broader systems. So in other words, we can't detach these broader systems from the data set here. And so one of the things that I've seen a lot within education research, more specifically, those who are coming from that quant crit perspective, they tend to, if we're talking about, this notion called the achievement gap, many of the scholars that are coming from a quant crit perspective, they're more so reframing that as an opportunity gap. So I'm not sure if any of you all are fans of like TV, but I don't know if you've seen like what is it called? Little Fires Everywhere. It's a book, but they had like a TV series adaptation. Kerry Washington was in it, and Reese Witherspoon, some two of my favorite actresses. But my point being is that there's a very tense scene in that series, and Kerry Washington's character is confronting Reese Witherspoon about her racial privilege and class privilege. And I think Reese had said something to the degree of like, well, I worked hard, this, that, and the third. And Kerry Washington's character says, you didn't make good choices, you had good choices. to make, right? And so just that little framing of how we're looking at, the issues that we're interrogating our research, quant crit perspective helps us to do that, to reframe that lens, if you will. Many of you in the chat had noted that, when you're coming from a quantitative perspective, you're socialized to think that the numbers are neutral, that, there's no bias in it, right? But if many quantitative researchers are using, for example, secondary data sets, right? And so, like I had said earlier, I mean, if you're trying to do, and again, I'm not a quantitative researcher, but my assumption is that if you're trying to do some type of regression and you're trying to figure out what variables to use, I mean, isn't that a subjective process, and the numbers don't exactly speak for themselves? And so, even that and just the interpretation of the data, that is subjective. Virginia and I, we've talked on numerous occasions about, like, why don't we publish work that is statistically insignificant, if you will? Why do we only publish work that is statistically significant? What could we learn from work that, again, is not quote unquote statistically insignificant, or is not statistically significant? And what does that even mean in terms of, like, I know what it means, but, like, who gets to determine that, and how was that created? Yes, Virginia put in the chat, very subjective process here. And then also, quant crit scholars are continuously asking the question of, how do I make sure that my interpretation centers an intersectional perspective, that I'm not making these essentialist claims from my data? And also, again, how does this help to support a social justice perspective? Another thing that I think quant crit does a very good job of is, interrogating this notion of a reference group, right? So for those who are in quantitative research, there's usually some type of reference group. Well, who gets to be the reference group? Who gets to be dubbed as normal, right? And again, what does that really say? So that's another thing that I really appreciate about this. And then also, from this perspective, if you're using quant crit in your research, another thing that comes up for me, if you're using this perspective, is a lot of quantitative research tends to be done in the lens of, like, comparing. So, for example, comparing how, Black students, do in terms of, like, test scores. I think I keep bringing that example up, compared to white students or other students, right? But we really have to be more critical about, is that comparison even necessary? And if it is, for what purpose, right? Because we can end up normalizing these racist assumptions that are embedded in our traditional methodology. So just being very, very, careful about that. And I think another thing that quant crit does a great job of is just helping us to really realize the priority of some of our research agendas. So, Virginia, you actually might appreciate this. So there was a study, and I'll put it in the chat here in just a second, done about 9 years ago. So it's a little outdated, but nevertheless, at the time, they found that only 1.3% of EdPsych journals focus on race as a research. Yeah, yeah. And so again, who gets to set that research agenda and why, right? That's another thing that quant crit, I think, does a very, very good job of doing, for sure. And then one last thing, when it comes to, centering a DEIJ lens, for my quant researchers in particular, I've, talked about this first point about 10 times right now, but it's okay that, you're going into this process understanding that you're not trying to present research as your research findings as neutral, right? But rather another way to better understand this phenomenon, right? So I think that's a better way to kind of approach the process here. And then also making sure that, especially if we're using secondary data sets, that not everyone's experience is going to be represented in that data set. And if it is, it might not be represented in an accurate way. So again, how do you account for that in your interpretation of your results? That's extremely, extremely important to at least consider. especially as you're talking about the implications of your results and in the discussion part of that paper. And then again, making sure that we're attending to these broader systemic issues and not, using our findings in a way where it's like, well, this can be presented as an individual issue. So going back to, my test scores example here, that Black students historically have not performed as well on standardized tests, making it seem like it's a Black student problem rather than what are some of the broader issues that are at play here. So moving on here to how this looks like it being DEIJ research and qualitative research, there's a lot of different things that it can look like. One of the things that we try to do in qualitative research is, of course, put out a positionality statement. But going back to quant crit really quickly, I've seen more quantitative researchers doing this because this idea that only qualitative researchers have to admit their biases up front. There are some quantitative researchers that are like, no, dog. we have to reveal our biases too up front as well. And so you were starting to see it in both, right? Yeah, so Virginia had put, as an amazing quantitative research she is, that she has started to write positionality statements for sure, for sure. And so again, a positionality statement is basically you reflecting on, your various different, not just identities, but your experiences, how you view the research process. You're stating that up front so that your readers can understand, okay, that's how, for example, Oya is, framing her research process or her question, or that's how Heather is kind of approaching, this problem or this phenomenon as she's, looking to really consider this from a deeper angle. So that's the point of our positionality statements. It is not to just state, I'm a Black queer woman, right? Okay, so what does that mean in light of the research? Like how does those identities or how do those identities affect the way in which I am approaching this subject? So it's taking it a step further and not just listing, your various different identities, okay? And then reflexivity, some of you who are coming more from a qualitative perspective, you might have heard this. So it's basically what it kind of sounds like. So you engaging in this, what we call critical self-reflection, not just in terms of like the biases. So this is during and after your research, but also like how exactly, what am I trying to say? What are you experiencing during that research process? So one of the things that I love to do as a qualitative research is what we call memoing. I'm not sure if some of you have heard of that. So when I am analyzing data, so for example, I had to recently analyze data from about first generation Latinx students. And as I was reading through the data, there was a lot of stuff that came up for me being a first generation, I'm not Latinx, but being a first generation former student myself. And so there was one part in the data where, I kind of felt like, and I think I can say this, I felt like some of the families of the people in the data that they weren't being as understanding, that they were trying to pull these, their student in five different directions. And I remember as I was analyzing that data, actually feeling upset because I was reflecting on my own experience as a first gen student, right? So memoing that as you're analyzing your data is very helpful because it really connects back to this critical self-reflection that's so key in qualitative research. And that sometimes can help to enrich your analysis for sure, just being aware of what's happening to you in that analysis process. So we're seeing more and more qualitative researchers doing that memoing for that reflexivity purpose. And then again, I just put here, I am sorry, I kind of touched on this. So I apologize for being repetitive, like positionality and reflexivity. The reason why we do it in qualitative research and the reason why I would argue that it's one way that we can center DEIJ in our research if we're coming from a qualitative perspective is that it really adds this level of trustworthiness. So I know in quantitative research, the word that's used there a lot is reliability and validity. And qualitative, it's more so like trustworthiness. So it just adds an added layer of trust to your research, right? And again, it helps us to center DEIJ more in our research process from a qualitative perspective. And then the last thing I want to talk about with qualitative research as it relates to DEIJ is this approach called participatory action research. So this is essentially when we fully try to at least engage people within the community that we're researching or that we're trying to better understand as, I guess you can say, key partners, right, in the research process. So I actually saw this done recently. I'm helping this woman out with her dissertation, and she's studying how Black women practice joy in academia. It's a beautiful dissertation. I can't wait till she defends it. And so one of the things that we did is we created what's called a peer research team. Now, this was a little difficult with IRB because IRB holds a lot of traditional assumptions about research. So that was a trip. But anyways, we had what's called a peer research team, not pure as in PURE, PER, EER. And the people that we ended up being participants in our research also helped us to draft questions for the focus group, or AKA the sister circle. That's what we called it. And so that was amazing to have them basically be a part of that research process. We're also at the part where the lead researcher is going to check back in with the participants to make sure that she's actually understanding their responses. So in the analysis part is what I'm trying to say. So involving those people still within the analysis part of your research to make sure that their stories are accurately interpreted and represented in your research. So that's a big part of participatory action research for sure. Veronica, going back to positionality statements, they put there are some elements of who we are as researchers that can't be hidden: gender representation, skin color, some disabilities. For those elements that are visible to others, what are the circumstances under which you share versus withhold information? That's an amazing question, Veronica. And I know we're kind of getting back here to the other point. I think, agency has to be centered, right? So some of that is the researcher's choice. But I would also say that's where that memoing, that reflexivity will actually help with your positionality statement. So if there are elements that, like, as you put here, that are invisible to others that are coming out in your memoing, I would say you probably need to go back and put that in your positionality statement as well. So again, for those elements that are invisible that you feel like are coming out in the analysis part, you're like, oh, wait, definitely put that in your positionality for sure. But that's a really good question. That's something I never honestly attended to, but I think that's a very important question. I'll pause there. I don't know if you had more to say about that, Veronica. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but okay, awesome, awesome. That's what I would do, and that's what I've seen being done as well. Great question. But really quickly, going back to participatory action research, because once again, I've pulled a Jasmine and I've talked too much, but hopefully this has been informative to you all. Um, yes, we're involving our participants in the actual research process, and we're making sure that we're doing this throughout the process, not just at the end where maybe we want clarification over something that they said, if you will. And then another reason why you'll see some scholars from a qualitative perspective doing this participatory action research approach is because they really like that it completely upends what we consider research, right? So again, this assumption that the researchers, their perspective is the only interpretation that's, accurate. No, absolutely not. I mean, who better to check in with in terms of your interpretation, your analysis of the data than the people, than the community, right? That make up your data set, right? And so I love participatory action research. It's a really great methodology to use, or method to use. And I will say, based upon my own experience, in terms of with IRB, it can be a little difficult just because IRB runs under very traditional assumptions of what we mean by research, if you will. Going to check here in the chat. Yes, memoing. Yeah, for sure. For sure. All right. And then the last thing I'll say about, for my qualitative researchers, before we get into some examples, I want you all to see or to determine whether or not a few studies I'll show you are examples of DEIJ research. For my qualitative researchers, please, please, please keep in mind, just because we are how do I say this? Just because neutrality and objectivity is not something that we are socialized into, it doesn't mean that our methods are, as I put here, inherently anti-racist, anti-oppressive, right? Does not mean that at all. Still, the types of questions that you're asking, the types of assumptions that you hold, that is where the true anti-oppressive work really comes into play for qualitative, for all researchers, for sure. We also have to keep in mind that intersectionality is still a lens that we want to use when we're analyzing our data. So there really is no, as I put here, there's not a huge need sometimes to compare the experiences of those who are coming from marginalized backgrounds to those who, are not necessarily coming from that perspective. And then also, I encourage you all, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods in general, to consider how are we categorizing our data, right? So if you're only focusing on, for example, sex, and I know for quantitative researchers, if you are using a secondary data set, the way that the government, I'm not even going to start with that, but if you're using a secondary data set, that could be limiting in terms of like how you're looking at gender, because oftentimes they're categorizing it as sex, right? Female or male. And it really begets this binary category. So we don't have a reflection of trans experiences, for example, or trans people experiences. And then also something that I've been seeing a lot, especially from qualitative researchers, is this notion that we're going to categorize our data as diverse data versus non-diverse data. I don't know what that means, y'all. what what does it mean to be diverse? And we're all diverse on this call here, right? So again, really making sure that we're being a bit intentional, more intentional about how we're categorizing certain things in our data for sure. Stacy asked in the chat, how much do you disclose the participants' race, ethnicity, gender, etc., when it could also make people re-identifiable? Great question. Virginia kind of responded to that and said, when I'm sharing data openly, I do not include this. If it could lead to being identifiable, yes. That would also be kind of like my recommendation as well. And then again, if you're coming more from a qualitative perspective, some of that choice, the decision that you make can be informed by your participants. So you can go back and ask them, like, are you okay with disclosing this information? I've done that before. And so that is kind of like the exciting thing about qualitative research, that you have a little bit more flexibility there in that regard. So I am seeing that we only have about 4 minutes left or so. And I don't want to rush through this last activity here. So I think if it's okay with you, Virginia, I think I'm actually going to pause here because, again, I really don't want to rush. Basically, I just had a few abstracts and I wanted you all to determine whether or not they were examples of DEIJ research or not. I think it's okay to just simply drop this in the chat and you can kind of reference this on your own time to figure out, is this actually attending to DEIJ or is it kind of just, you know, something that people are calling DEIJ, for lack of better words. So I'll go ahead
Yeah,
and
we can do a
pause
part
there.
three.
Yes, yes, exactly. And we can always that literally can be, yes, that's a great idea, Virginia. That
We could
can
do
literally
part
be
three and do
the
like
entire
activities
workshop.
and more like we could like workshop our research
Right.
questions.
Yes, yes, for
If you're
sure,
down
for
for it, I'm
sure.
down for it.
I am too. I am
Awesome.
for sure. What I like to do here is just drop a few resources in the chat. This first resource is from my home institution, Ohio State. They have what's called a qual lab here. So for my qualitative researchers, this is a great just resource for you. They have a lot of just in general qualitative methods resources. For my quantitative scholars who are kind of interested in learning more about quant crit, I'll go ahead and drop this Google Doc from Dr. Carlton Fong. I believe he is at Texas State University, but he delivered this amazing, 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 amazing talk about quant crit. So that's that for you. And then Virginia, I'll actually drop in the chat that study that I referenced that talked about how there's only like 1.6%
Mm.
of, or, of the top ed psych, journals, only 1.6% of them discuss race. So that's in the chat as well. Yes, he's great. He is great. Any
He's
questions? I'm so sorry. I did it again. I talked too much.
okay. It's such an important topic. So as I
What
had
were
mentioned
the
before,
main things to look out for in terms of REB for participatory action? So I
Mhm.
was thinking of collecting data from neurodiverse students, and
Yeah.
I want to consult a group that contains neurodiverse students. Like, should I include that? Obviously, I would include that in my
Yes.
REB. Like, what were the
Yeah.
main, I guess, barriers? What were the main things they
I
look
think
for?
so. So I'm at my campus office. So how do I say that? There's a lot that I could say about my particular experience with this one. I think it was more so I had to list my peer team as why am I failing to think of the word? Investigators.
Collaborator? Oh, invest.
Collaborators, yes. And so just going through that process, they also had to be, city certified, all of that stuff. Like they had to have those certifications. So that was kind of, I understand, but that was it took a lot longer. um I still had to have questions for the IRB. It couldn't be like, hey, I'm going to create these questions with these folks. It was like, well, you have to have the questions in order to submit the application.
Mm,
So I would say, from my experience, those were the two big things
mm.
that really held up the process. The IRB process was very long.